For visitors arriving at the Italian capital of Rome, there's the opportunity to explore not one, but two magnificent cities. For hidden behind ancient stone walls, to the west of the River Tiber, lies the extraordinary Vatican City-State. This is the realm of the papacy, one of the most sacred places in Christendom, where the Apostle Peter was martyred, and where, over the years, Roman emperors and popes have built and decorated breathtaking monuments to celebrate their faith. The wealth of history within this tiny enclave is boundless, and for those who make the journey here, there are some intriguing sights waiting to be discovered. From the pioneering architecture of the Baroque, to a breathtaking array of frescoes, artwork and sculptures from antiquity and beyond, there's little doubt as to why Vatican City has now been declared a World Heritage Site for its extraordinary cultural importance. Pilgrims have been drawn here from the furthest reaches of the world for almost 2,000 years, but the domain of the Holy See also stretches beyond Vatican walls. From ancient castles to towering basilicas, there are plenty of other fascinating locations for the intrepid traveller to explore. And with such an array of sights to see, it is now time to begin our tour of this truly unique city. When you enter the realm of Vatican City, there are no barriers or custom posts, so you could be forgiven for thinking you are still in the Italian capital of Rome. But as you step onto the cobbles of St. Peter's Square, you are in fact entering the smallest independent country in the world. This state is so small that its capital city fills its borders. In fact, with a surface area of less than a square kilometre, you can walk your way around its boundaries in just 40 minutes. Although bursting with ancient history and monuments, the Vatican City-State only came into being in the last century, when the Italian dictator Mussolini and Pope Pius XI signed the Lateran Treaty in 1929. This pact ended years of bitter conflict between Italy and the papacy, which had come to a head in 1871, when Italian troops occupied papal territory and proclaimed Rome the capital of the new Kingdom of Italy. During this time, Pope Pius XI's predecessors lived as prisoners within the Vatican, refusing to acknowledge the authority of the new kingdom. It wasn't until the negotiations with Mussolini that the Pope finally recognised the new Italy, and the Italian government accepted the sovereignty of the Vatican State. To celebrate the conciliation, Mussolini, who was keen to shape Rome into a new empire, bulldozed streets and buildings to build a great road through the heart of the city to the magnificent St. Peter's Basilica and Square. The wide and bustling Via della Conciliazione, which brings so many people to this most historic of sites, is today symbolic of the pact between Rome and the Vatican State. Although it detracts from the original plan for the beautiful piazza at its head, which was to be hidden behind the narrow streets of Rome, few will be disappointed when arriving at the forecourt of the majestic St. Peter's Basilica. Two vast semicircular colonnades with rows upon rows of Doric columns enfold the elliptical piazza. And in the words of the architect Gian Lorenzo Bernini, who designed this incredible space, the colonnades embrace visitors with the arms of Mother Church. Bernini conceived and built the square between 1655 and 1667, during the pontificate of Pope Alexander VII. Ever since then, it has certainly been a space where all are welcomed. Catholics and non-Catholics alike have gathered here to listen to papal speeches, celebrate festivities, and simply absorb the extraordinary surroundings. As you soak up the atmosphere, you can see why the spectacular approach to the basilica has been hailed a Baroque masterpiece. Gaze upwards, and visitors are greeted by the benevolent stares of 140 saints, martyrs, and pilgrims who stand above the 284 columns surrounding the plaza. Meanwhile, below, the sound of gentle bubbling fountains adds to the tranquility of the perfectly designed space. The fountain on the right of the square is the work of Carlo Maderno and dates back to 1613, while the left-hand fountain was built 40 years later to add to the symmetry of Bernini's design. Those who want to really experience the ultimate harmony of the Baroque should seek out the white discs on the ground near the fountains. Stand on these, and all the surrounding columns merge into one, creating a stunning view. From here, it's difficult not to miss, perhaps, the most important element in St. Peter's Square, which towers above the piazza. This giant obelisk, carved from a single piece of red granite, is over 4,000 years old and was originally brought to Rome from Egypt in 36 AD. Emperor Caligula used it to adorn a circus he'd built for chariot racing on Vatican Hill. But 1,500 years later, the decision was made to move it. The task required the work of 900 men and 140 horses who worked tirelessly over a period of 4 months to move the obelisk to its present position. It has stood here at the centre of St. Peter's Square since 1586, and since its arrival in Rome, this ancient monument has been a silent witness to events that have not only shaped the history of the Vatican State, but firmly founded the area as a place of Catholic worship. To understand more, stepping back in time to the year 46 AD will provide some valuable historical insight. Almost 2,000 years ago, the area now covered by the Vatican city-state was known to the Romans as Vaticanus, a name derived from the Etruscan word for soothsayer. This area, made up of a marshy valley and hills on the west bank of the river Tiber, was where Caligula built his circus. However, when Emperor Nero took the reins of power, he found a new use for Caligula's racing circuit. In 46 AD, there was a terrible fire in Rome, which destroyed much of the city. In order to appease his subjects, Nero looked for someone to blame and began the persecution of Christians in the city. Soon after the fire, there were great celebrations in which they were thrown to wild beasts, crucified and burned alive, while Nero and his entourage watched on. It is believed that among the tortured Christians was the Apostle Peter, who was, according to tradition, the first bishop of Rome, and therefore the first ever pope. He felt unworthy of dying in the same manner as Jesus, so at his own request, he was crucified head down near the obelisk that today stands at the centre of St. Peter's Square. It was the martyrdom of Peter on this site which would shape the history of Vaticanus for centuries to come. A shrine was built in memory of the apostle, and while over the centuries, pilgrims were drawn here to pay homage to the saint, new structures were built on the site of the original shrine. These were expanded and rebuilt until transformed into the magnificent St. Peter's Basilica that now dominates the Vatican Kingdom. Pope Julius II commissioned the architect Bramante to create this extraordinary building to replace an older basilica in 1503, but it would take over a century before the church was complete. During this time, Bramante died, new architects were appointed, and arguments raged between the clergy as they debated designs for this most sacred building. In 1547, Michelangelo was appointed architect, and the ground plan and dome are largely inspired by his designs. Meanwhile, by the 17th century, Carlo Moderno had begun work designing the monumental facade. Perhaps the most famous element in his grand design is the central window and balcony, from where the Pope delivers his solemn benedictions and seasonal blessings to those gathered below. By the time it was completed in 1626, this was the largest church in the Christian world, and to really appreciate the size, visitors will need to take a step inside. This vast building is 137 metres high and 218 metres long, and with stunning sculptures and artwork bathed in the ethereal light from Michelangelo's cupola, it creates a truly breathtaking sight. The internal elements were brought together beneath the expert eye of Bernini, the architect who would later design St. Peter's Square, and he's certainly been responsible for some of the most impressive embellishments to be found within this great church. On entering St. Peter's Basilica, the eyes are immediately drawn to the canopy known as the baldacchino, which stands above the high altar. Bernini was commissioned to fashion this structure in 1624, when he was just 26 years old, and it took 9 years and bronze from as far as Venice to complete. Columns are twisted and spiralling, according to traditional depictions of the columns that supported Solomon's temple, and among the foliage bees swarm, the traditional symbol of the Barberini Pope Urban VIII. It provides a fitting crown to the Apostle's grave, which is thought to lie directly below, and when unveiled in 1633, it confirmed Bernini's status as an architect of genius. Bernini then turned his attention to another precious relic, the so-called Cathedra Petri, or Throne of St. Peter. This sacred chair was often claimed to have been used by the Apostle, and Bernini fittingly enshrined it in a large bronze throne held by statues of the 4 doctors of the church. Behind, a blaze of light comes through a window, illuminating the dove of the Holy Spirit, and although evidence now suggests the chair only dates back to the 12th century, long after St. Peter's death, it is nevertheless a glorious sight. There are other artists who have made important contributions to the basilica, and one sculpture not to be missed is the beautiful Pieta, created by a young Michelangelo. Lovingly carved out in marble, it depicts the grieving Virgin Mary holding her dead son. The moving scene has been hailed a Renaissance masterpiece and is the only sculpture by Michelangelo to carry his signature. This was chiselled on the ribbon crossing the Virgin's shoulder when the artist heard that the public doubted the Pieta was his work. Michelangelo was also responsible for designing the dome of the basilica, although by this time he was much older and died before it was complete. You can walk around the overlook that rings the interior of the cupola to observe beautiful mosaic portraits of the apostles up close. And for those hardy enough, there are 300 narrow steps to the top of the dome, where a terrace at the base of the dome's lantern offers spectacular views of the city. If you prefer to avoid the dizzying heights of the cupola, there's also the opportunity to visit mausoleums deep underground. Excavations began beneath the basilica in the 1940s, and they eventually revealed this extraordinary Roman necropolis which once spread over the Vatican hillside. Walk along a well-preserved street lined with bricks to find ancient mausoleums decorated in once richly coloured mosaics and beautiful frescoes. These are the burial places of early Christians. Nearly 2,000 years ago, families would have come here to remember their dead. Perhaps more importantly, though, people came to the necropolis to pay homage to St. Peter. Archaeologists spent decades hunting for the shrine of St. Peter the Apostle, and after false hopes were raised and an array of bones were removed for analysis, they were eventually rewarded with the news they'd been waiting for. In 1968, Pope Paul VI announced that the relics of St. Peter have been identified in a manner which we believe convincing. A red-painted plaster wall is thought to mark the St. Peter's burial place, which now rests behind a glass panel, and here visitors can see the sacred shrine of the fisherman turned bishop that marked the beginnings of Vatican City. It was the Emperor Constantine who filled these mausoleums with earth in the 4th century to protect them from the elements and from grave robbers. Then above, he began to build the first basilica in honour of St. Peter, directly over the small shrine marking his grave. It was in fact Constantine who changed the status of the Christians in Rome forever, when he decreed Christianity a lawful religion. This would create many dramatic changes in the city of Rome, but Constantine had good reason for his chosen faith. The reason for the emperor's change in faith dates back to the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 AD. The night before the battle, which would decide the fate of the Roman Empire, Constantine saw a shining cross in the sky, accompanied by the words, "By this sign thou shalt conquer." Of course, when the emperor defeated his rival, Emperor Maxentius, just outside Rome, he swiftly gave full credit to the Christian god. To show his gratitude, Constantine decided to build a great church. But although he would eventually build the foundations of St. Peter's Basilica on Vatican Hill, his first church was 3 miles away, at a completely different location. Leaving the protective walls of Vatican City, a short detour takes us to the foot of Lateran Hill, where the true Mother Church of the Roman Catholic faith stands. The Papal Archbasilica of San Giovanni in Laterano, or St. John Lateran, was built on the army barracks of Constantine's rival Maxentius. It remains to this day the cathedral church of the Bishop of Rome, now the only Catholic bishop called Pope, and the palace built on the same site would be the very first home of the papacy. The basilica is best approached from the splendid piazza, which, like St. John Lateran itself, is named after the Laterani family, who once owned this land. After repairs and rebuilding over the many centuries, the church was radically restored in the Baroque style in the 17th and 18th centuries, and the facade, designed by Alessandro Galilei, is certainly impressive. Sculptures of St. John the Evangelist and St. John the Baptist are among the gigantic statues adorning the balustrade, and at the centre stands Christ the Saviour, one hand on the cross and the other reaching out to the heavens. The basilica was in fact originally dedicated to Christ the Saviour, and only later to St. John the Evangelist and St. John the Baptist. The entrance is framed by a pair of colossal Corinthian pilasters, and visitors may recognise elements inspired by St. Peter's Basilica as they take in the magnificent portico. The ancient bronze doors at the centre have been taken from the Senate House in the Imperial Forum, while the last door on the right is the Holy Door. This was last opened in the year 2000 to mark the start of the Holy Year, which occurs every 25 years. The interior is equally as impressive after its Baroque refurbishment in the 17th century. This is mainly the work of Francesco Borromini, who was commissioned in 1646 by Pope Innocent X. Statues of the 12 apostles flank the nave, while the ceiling is richly decorated with beautiful frescoes drawing the eye irresistibly to the heavens. At the heart of the basilica at the papal altar stands a glorious Gothic canopy decorated with mosaics. The wooden table below was originally thought to have been used by St. Peter himself, although nowadays it is believed to date back to the 4th century. Here, in the first Basilica of Rome, no one but the Pope can celebrate Mass, and this is certainly an impressive space for prayers and benedictions. The first Pope to take up residence at St. John Lateran was Pope Sylvester I in 314 AD. At the time, the group of Lateran buildings included a baptistry and a palace as well as the basilica, and Lateran Hill became the official papal residence until the papacy moved to Avignon in France in the 14th century. In 1929, the Lateran Treaty was signed here, ensuring that the magnificent basilica still remained within the sovereignty of the Vatican State, although it lies outside the borders of the protective papal enclave. Time now to rest from our busy trek and take advantage of nighttime Rome to drink Amarone wines, eat cannelloni, and soak up the atmosphere of this beautiful city as darkness falls. To awake refreshed and keen, stroll back to the region of Rome known as the Borgo and find the entrance to one of the most visited museums in the world. Back in the region of Rome known as the Borgo, you can stroll along the outer walls of the city-state to find the entrance to one of the most visited museums in the world. The Vatican museums are crammed with the most beautiful and awe-inspiring work you can possibly imagine. There's something for everyone here, and from elegant squares and Egyptian relics to ancient statues and breathtaking artwork, the experience of wandering through the many rooms and hallways is truly fascinating. With so much to see, it's difficult to know where to start on arriving, but a good point to set off from is probably the Cortile della Pigna. This is an incredible space with a name inspired by the colossal bronze pine cone nestling beneath a vast niche at the far end of the courtyard. The pine cone, or pigna in Italian, originally decorated a fountain in ancient Rome and was moved here in the 15th century, where today it is carefully guarded by 2 bronze peacocks, also dating back to the time of ancient Rome. There's also a more modern sculpture here, created by Arnaldo Pomodoro in 1990, named Sphere Within a Sphere, or Sfera con Sfera in Italian. Its fractured surface and complex inner structure was designed to reflect the difficulties of the modern world at the end of the 2nd millennium. One Italian minister described it as a world torn asunder by the horrors of war and suffering giving birth to another world. The dazzling shape at the centre of the upper courtyard certainly catches the eye, but there's little time to linger with so many museums to explore. The Egyptian Museum and the Etruscan Museum are easily accessible from the cortile and are filled with some fascinating relics. But a museum that really must be visited if you're limited with time is the Pio Clementino Museum, which has the best of Greek and Roman sculpture held at the Vatican museums. In the leafy cortile Ottagono, which is within the Pio Clementino, statues are displayed in each alcove, and among these you'll find the breathtaking Laocoon group. This beautiful statue was found on Rome's Esquiline Hill, which had once stood in the palace of the Emperor Titus. It shows Laocoon, a priest who had warned fellow Trojans of the dangers of the famous wooden horse, being punished by the goddess Athena. He and his son struggle hopelessly beneath the crushing grip of 2 monster serpents in this monumental sculpture, and it is no wonder that visiting tourists flock here to admire the sight. Another statue in the Pio Clementino Museum that can't be missed is the Apollo Belvedere. This stunning marble sculpture depicts the Greek god Apollo and is thought to date back to 120 AD. It was rediscovered in the 15th century and is thought to epitomise the ideal of aesthetic perfection for the Western world. Both the Laocoon group and the Apollo Belvedere were brought to the Vatican museums by Pope Julius II, who, although renowned for his fierce temper to such an extent that he was nicknamed Il Papa Terribile, he had a great eye for art. Julius helped beautify and transform the buildings of the Vatican into a work of art, adding to the beautiful frescoes already adorning the buildings. Prior to Julius's reign, the Borgia family had ruled over the Papal States. They were a family hungry for power, and the era of the Borgia had been rife with corruption. Bribery, adultery, incest and murder were all connected with the name. When Julius succeeded Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo de Borgia, he was determined to rid himself of their memory. Like the popes before them, the Borgia had made their mark on the palaces, and nowhere is this more evident than in the Borgia apartment. Adapted for use by Pope Alexander, the rooms here were decorated by paintings and frescoes in the late 15th century. The Renaissance painter Bernardino di Beto Pinturicchio used medieval iconography to celebrate the supposedly divine origins of the Borgia. But when Julius II came to power, he saw little to admire in the artwork. Julius felt uncomfortable in the richly decorated rooms, which he described as carrying a foul and villainous memory. So he decided to move to a new part of the papal palaces. He took on a brilliant young artist called Raphael Sanzio, who came from the small city of Urbino in central Italy. Commissioned to decorate the new papal suite in 1508, Raphael would not disappoint. These 4 rooms not only outshine the Borgia apartments, as Julius no doubt hoped they would, but the so-called Raphael rooms are now among the greatest treasures of the Vatican museums. The frescoes, painted by the artist and his apprentices, are absolutely breathtaking. and those wandering through the rooms will be swept away by the extraordinary images drawn from the Vatican's past. From medieval miracles in the room of Heliodorus to battle scenes in the room of Constantine, many important stories are told on these walls. The first room to be decorated with Raphael's frescoes was the Room of the Signatura, which was where Pope Julius once had his library. Colourful allegories representing humanist ideals cover the walls, and the most popular painting is without doubt the School of Athens, which was also one of the first works to be completed in Pope Julius's new suite. The painting boasts important characters from the realms of art and philosophy, with Plato and Aristotle dominating the scene, and if you look closely, you can even see Raphael himself. Raphael also included another artist in the painting, who was one of the most admired in Vatican City and Raphael's greatest rival. The character, sitting in the foreground, wearing the famous boots, which he almost never removed, is thought to be none other than Michelangelo. It was added after Raphael glimpsed the spectacular frescoes Michelangelo had begun working on in another part of the papal palace. And if we now take our leave of the colourful Raphael rooms, it's time to visit the extraordinary religious space which brought his rival so much admiration. Ironically, it was the envy of the other papal artists that led to Michelangelo's commission to decorate the chapel of Pope Sixtus IV, better known as the Sistine Chapel. They hoped that the sculptor responsible for the beautiful Pieta would refuse the commission, and in doing so, alienate the Pope. As predicted, Michelangelo protested. "Paint the ceiling? It is not my trade." Julius II was, however, adamant, and the artist finally took to the challenge in 1508, the same year that Raphael was painting the papal suite. While decorating the chapel, Michelangelo had to endure painting in the most uncomfortable conditions imaginable. But as visitors absorb the beautifully decorated ceiling and the amazing images he created, which recount events from the book of Genesis, there can be no question that this was the crowning achievement in his life's work, and indeed one of the greatest masterpieces in Western art. Before Michelangelo's brush began its work, the chapel was covered in paintings of an earlier era, and some of the best of these can still be seen, decorating the side panels beneath the ceiling. These were by the great Renaissance artists Sandro Botticelli and Pietro Perugino, and include The Punishment of Corah and a painting of Christ giving the keys to Peter. Although the work on the ceiling was completed in 1512, Michelangelo was asked to return in 1535, this time by Pope Paul III, to fresco the altar wall with scenes from the Last Judgment. This final piece would take years to complete, and is a stunning end to a work of art that is now indisputably the jewel in the crown of the Vatican museums. Raphael would never see his old rival's completed masterpiece. He died on his 37th birthday after catching a fever in 1520. Although Raphael could not quite match the genius of Michelangelo's frescoes, he nevertheless left some impressive paintings within the Vatican museums, the most famous of which can now be seen on display in the Pinacoteca, which is right at the other end of the museum complex. The Transfiguration dominates the room it hangs in, and many believe that this triumphant image of Christ ascending into the heavens is his most divine work. When Raphael died, it was hung above his coffin incomplete until his pupils added the final touches. If you have time to visit the other rooms of the Pinacoteca, you can find an impressive array of artwork, from Leonardo da Vinci to Caravaggio and much more besides. Nearby, there's a host of displays to explore in the Vatican Library. This was commissioned by Pope Sixtus V in 1587 to house the original library's overflowing collections. Sixtus loved manuscripts, and his collections have now expanded to include more than 2 million books and a total of 150,000 manuscripts. They include some intriguing papers, including a letter written by Mary Queen of Scots before her execution in 1587 and a love letter sent by Henry VIII to Anne Boleyn. You could spend hours in the library alone, and there's still a lot to see in the museums. According to one guidebook, it takes 2 days and 4 miles of walking to really do the Vatican Museums justice. But for those who may already be a little overwhelmed, it is probably time to step outside and take in some of the surroundings of the Vatican city-state. Over the centuries, with so many treasures to protect, the popes of Vatican City have had to contend with many invaders, and accordingly built and rebuilt defences. Following the sack of Rome by the Saracens in 846 AD, Pope Leo IV ensured that Rome would never again be threatened by an army of Arabs and built the Leonine Wall. This ran from Castle Sant'Angelo near the River Tiber and up the slopes of Vatican Hill to encircle the basilica. It enclosed what would become known as the Leonine City, which was much bigger than the present-day Vatican city-state. The quarter that lies outside the boundaries of Vatican City, known as the Borgo, was once a bustling part of the ancient Leonine city. With the arrival of the papacy, it swiftly gained in importance, and pilgrims became the population's main source of income. There was also an increase of wealthy families in the area, which in turn led to the construction of beautiful palazzi and newer and better roads. For centuries, the people in this sprawling area have catered to those visiting Vatican City with food, shelter and souvenirs, and little has changed over the years. From shops filled with papal memorabilia, to an array of restaurants and bars offering delicious Italian food, the Borgo has plenty to offer the tourist keen to take a break from the wealth of culture within the Vatican enclave. Wander through the streets here, and you'll find there are plenty of reminders of the Vatican's emphasis on security. Near the gateway of the Porta Angelica, just below the colonnade of St. Peter's Square, the barracks of the Swiss Guards can be found. These men have been protecting the Pope and his properties for over 500 years and are titled with defending the freedom of the Church. They first entered Rome on January the 22nd, 1506, at the request of Pope Julius II, who had witnessed them in battle, and they would play a crucial part in the safety of the papacy from that moment on. Perhaps their finest hour was on May the 6th, 1527, when Spanish and German troops, led by Charles V, attacked the city of Rome. Defences collapsed within hours, and almost the entire guard was massacred as they tried to defend their pope. Only 42 out of the 189 soldiers on duty survived. Their bravery, however, ensured the survival of Pope Clement VIII, who seized the opportunity to escape from Vatican City down the Passetto di Borgo. This raised passageway, which can still be seen today, was built onto the north wall of the Leonine city, and the thick walls created a fortified escape route to the fortress of Castle Sant'Angelo. The secret corridor is still very much operational. It has even played a key role in the Hollywood movie Angels and Demons. But centuries ago, it was crucial to the survival of Pope Clement and his entourage. While the troops of Charles V occupied Rome and the Vatican back in the 16th century, the fortified Castle Sant'Angelo became a papal refuge. For 5 months, the invaders raped and pillaged and destroyed countless works of art. hundreds of murdered citizens were thrown into the Tiber, and as thousands of others were hastily buried, plague became epidemic. The Pope remained safe inside Castle St. Angelo, however, until he was eventually able to escape unharmed. Castle St. Angelo was actually never intended to be a fortress. It was originally a mausoleum constructed by Hadrian, who's considered one of Rome's 5 good emperors, who ruled supreme when the empire was at its most powerful. The mausoleum acquired the name of St. Angelo in the 7th century, when it was believed an angel had appeared on its roof to announce the end of the plague. Down through the ages, the castle has had many different functions, and after its days as a fortress, it became a prison, an army barracks, and finally a museum. Today, within the thick walls of the castle, there are many corridors and rooms to be explored and artifacts to enjoy. And if you're keen to take a break and soak up the atmosphere of Rome, at the top of the castle you can enjoy a wonderful panoramic view of the city and the impressive dome of St. Peter's Basilica. Down below, on the banks of the river Tiber, you'll find another construction that can be attributed to Emperor Hadrian. The Pont Sant'Angelo, or Sant'Angelo Bridge, was originally built in 134 AD and spans the river connecting the castle to central Rome. This beautifully elegant construction is lined with statues of angels lovingly shaped by sculptures of the Bernini school, and each one is adorned with instruments from the crucifixion of Christ. The bridge was once a vital route for pilgrims as they travelled to St. Peter's Basilica, but during the Jubilee of 1450, this would have disastrous consequences. The crowds of pilgrims were so great that the balustrades yielded, and many of those crossing drowned in the swirling waters of the river below. So that this would never happen again, houses at the head of the bridge and a Roman triumphal arch were pulled down in order to widen the route for pilgrims. Though today many more bridges span the river Tiber, Pont Sant'Angelo is still a popular crossing and provides a truly picturesque addition to the Roman landscape. Having travelled across the river, now outside the confines of Vatican City, visitors should take the opportunity to explore the city of Rome a little. And from busy shopping districts to elaborate fountains, there's plenty to see. Heading east from the river, some of Rome's most famous monuments can be found. The Pantheon can also be attributed to the work of Emperor Hadrian, and the bronze from this incredible structure was in fact removed by Bernini to be used in the famous baldacchino in St. Peter's Basilica. The Pantheon was originally a place of worship to honour the gods of Olympus, but since the days of the Renaissance it has been both a tomb and a shrine, and among those buried here is the great artist Raphael. But remaining on the Vatican Trail, there are some more important buildings to see, which, like the Basilica of San Giovanni in Laterano, are some of the enclaves of the Vatican State located deep within Italian territory. To the east of the city, we find the beautiful Santa Maria Maggiore, or St. Mary Major, which is one of the only 4 Catholic churches that holds the title of Major Basilica, the other 3 being St. Peter, St. John Lateran, and St. Paul outside the walls. According to legend, Pope Liberius founded this magnificent building after a dream, which the Virgin Mary instructed him to build it wherever snow fell that night. Although it was the height of summer, in the morning snow dusted the Esquiline Hill, and here the church was built. This is one of the first churches dedicated to the Virgin Mary, although it is now thought that Pope Sixtus III actually built most of the present church in the 5th century. Much of the interior and exterior is more recent, dating back to 14th and 18th centuries, and Rome's tallest campanile at 75 metres became a major feature when it was added in 1377. When the popes returned to Rome after the period of the Avignon papacy back in the 14th century, the buildings of this basilica became their temporary palace. The papal residence would eventually move to Vatican City, but until then, St. Mary Major provided a more than adequate home for the religious leaders. Step inside and you can see why. The interior of the immense church is as spectacular as any of the other major basilicas and is dominated by a long nave flanked with 40 ancient columns. Above 5th century mosaic panels represent events from the Old Testament in vivid detail, and the coffered ceiling is said to be decorated with the first gold to have been brought from the New World. Many important figures from Vatican history have been buried in this church, and as well as the tombs of different popes, visitors can find the burial place of the architect and artist Bernini at the end of the nave on the right. This simple, humble tomb for the Bernini family lies near the much more impressive inlaid marble tomb of the Cardinal Consalvo Rodriguez, who died in 1299. From the richly decorated chapels to the Baroque baptistry, Santa Maria Maggiore may not be as large as St. Peter's Basilica, but it leaves a lasting impression on all who take the time to visit. Having seen 3 major basilicas of the Roman Catholic Church, to end our journey through the domain of the Vatican City-State, one last major basilica of the papacy remains to be explored. Still on Vatican territory, but 7 kilometres to the south of the city-state, lies the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls. Like the basilicas of St. Peter's and St. John Lateran, this building was founded by Constantine. The Christian emperor built this incredible church over the burial place of St. Paul, who was one of the most influential of the early Christian missionaries. Contemporary of St. Peter, he too suffered beneath the rule of Emperor Nero, and it is thought he was beheaded around 65 or 67 AD. Before the new Basilica of St. Peter was consecrated in 1626, this basilica, dedicated to Paul the Apostle, was the biggest in Rome. After being damaged by attacking Saracens in the 9th century, a massive defensive wall was built to protect it against future invasions, and even today this creates an impressive sight. Safely hidden within, there are some magnificent treasures. Highlights include the elegant cloister of the Basilica's monastery, which was erected between 1220 and 1241. They surround peaceful gardens, and as this is the least crowded of all the major basilicas, you can really enjoy the feeling of space and tranquility here. Taking a look at the beautiful mosaics of the apse is another must. Made by Venetian artists, it depicts Christ flanked by the apostles Peter, Paul, Andrew and Luke. Meanwhile, below the altar lie the remains of St. Paul beneath a marble tombstone deep underground. Tragically, much of the original basilica was destroyed in a fire in 1823, but it was swiftly restored to its former glory, and visitors are rarely disappointed when they come to explore the church, which has now been declared a national monument by the Italian government. Sadly, with this last enclave of the Vatican city-state, our tour of papal territory must finally come to a close. Exploring the sacred locations of the Roman Catholic Church and the treasures of Vatican City will have undoubtedly captivated all those travelling here, and this most spiritual voyage into the histories of martyrs, emperors and popes cannot fail to fascinate anyone who ventures within the confines of the sovereign state. There is so much to see in this tiny city, which though small has combined the genius of the world's greatest artists to create a truly spectacular capital for the Christian world. Visitors will be overwhelmed by the breathtaking views in every corner, and those who come here soon discover why people are drawn from across the globe to soak up the glorious sights. From spectacular artwork to awe-inspiring architecture, a journey here will prove not just intriguing, but completely unforgettable.
Kyrie